or to reference that old thing they did in the originals, and we go, aha, that's like the thing from the first movie, but it feels completely shallow, and it makes it feel like that character never actually progressed beyond that point if they're doing it again. They're stuck in some loop repeating over the same ground forever, like they're trapped inside some developed GIF or something. That's the complete opposite to the closure of a finished and fulfilling character arc. Reboot can mean many things, and in the more bigger general category of ways to keep a franchise going, there are an endless cluster of words like hard reboots, soft reboots, spin-offs, remakes, sequels, prequels, cinematic universe. Hollywood is obsessed with finding new ways to keep their treasured IP going as long as humanly possible. And I mentioned in my last video to do with modern franchises more generally, they aren't always a bad thing, you know. Sometimes you need sequels to carry on a story to its natural conclusion, but even beyond then, some writers have invented vast and interesting worlds that are just begging for further stories. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and then decided there was more to be expanded, so along came The Lord of the Rings, and then The Silmarillion, but I'm not even going to pretend I've read The Silmarillion. Breaking Bad finished, and then along came Better Call Saul, which some people argue was even better than the original. I think there's even examples of not particularly successful franchise extenders that, even if they weren't executed well, ones that still showed a lot of potential and promise in their concepts. Like, the original Star Wars trilogy left you with a great deal of intrigue about Darth Vader's past, about Obi-Wan's younger days, about how everything came to be. Whether or not you like the prequels, for many the shoddy writing ruined them, but there was, in principle, the potential to do something wonderful there, I think. I say that because I reckon a general opinion about reboots and sequels and all of that stuff is that they can be good, but only if they're written and executed well. Otherwise, they risk tarnishing love for the original story that you once cherished. There's a weird sort of horror, I think, to seeing the world and characters you were once deeply invested in suddenly just not behaving like themselves, doing odd things because the writers weren't sure what to do with them. That's far worse than killing them off. All of that is true, but I just feel like saying only extend the franchise if you're going to write something good is such a simple answer to give. Yeah, most of the time they aren't good. Jurassic World is awful in my opinion. The Star Wars sequel trilogy is such a mess, it's kind of baffling how much money went into it. So why is it things keep going wrong? All writers in Hollywood aren't bad, even if some of them definitely are. What's the problem, you know? We're going to discuss both that and why also soft reboots are the worst thing in existence. The worst thing ever. Nothing is worse. Okay, so the first point I've got to make is pretty obvious, to be fair. Art is increasingly seen by Hollywood executives less as art and more as just a product to sell. Obviously, their main goal is always making profit. That's not going to change, but it's becoming increasingly clear that Hollywood doesn't need to make something of great quality in order to produce profits. What they need to do is produce something that they can market very effectively. So I think that's one problem. Marketing has gotten so much smarter in the last several decades. They really know how to sell to us idiots now. We're all aware a lot of the stuff being produced isn't good, but there's also no avoiding it, and there's lots of tactics to make you intrigued even if you expect it to be bad, or tactics to drown out the criticism against it and just find ways to build hype regardless of how many letdowns have come beforehand. Marketing now is so good at its job that the actual quality of the films themselves simply aren't as important, so why bother pumping a lot of money and time into something high quality when a bit of spectacle and hype is enough? Here's my second point though. If art is seen less like art and more just like a product to shift, then quantity becomes far more important than quality. Well, not quantity, more speed really. How quickly can we produce and shift this product so that we can get on to making the next one and selling that, you know? There's a real pressure to produce films at a rapid pace precisely because this is what they're for. And as a result, the actual creators behind these films aren't often given the three most important things they need to create something good. The three I'm imagining off my head, which are space, time, and consistency. Often they're rushed at a breakneck pace that denies them the chance to properly plan or to edit and think everything through, or there's endless studio interference distorting whatever the creator's original vision was, to which you kind of get that famous proverb that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. Or there's like so much changing of staff, one director brought in and then replaced, then a new producer put in charge, then however many years of developmental hell before finally something is hashed together. That lack of consistency too also means there can be no real thread to the production or to the film itself. All of that makes it incredibly hard to produce something good, especially if there's not that much to work with in the first place, if the material isn't that deep. I guess there's another point there as well, kind of the reason there is so much interference in a creator's true vision, because there's sort of a Hollywood mantra that says take no risks. If something perfectly cliché and dull and a bit safe still produces a good profit nowadays, then there's no point risking danger by letting the creator explore something wild. But that's supposed to be the main purpose of art, really. One of its purposes anyway, exploration. There's no adventure ever as fun as diving into the fictional world of a character you don't know, slowly becoming invested in their journey and struggles and the world they're caught up in. It's exciting because it feels new, it feels vibrant. And also in a thematic sense, you feel like the story is exploring certain ideas, not always presenting an argument, but exploring what certain moral dilemmas or experiences or emotional difficulties can be like. In a way, writing a story is a means for the writer themselves to explore all those things, and then us watching or reading the story feel that in its creation. But not if what we're presented is the same as everything else, not if it treads old ground, but often without the same depth, because it's that risk adverse. Creativity kind of is about risk, because that's where the adventure is. My final point before I move on to talking about soft reboots is not every fictional world or story is capable of being expanded. There's not always space for that, as much as Hollywood tries to force it, trying to stretch out a shoe to fit a foot that's too big for it. Some stories can be remade in new ways, like film adaptations of books are normally the big thing for this that works. Not only do you get to see it in a new medium, but very often, because films are much shorter, they're having to take key points from the books and run that as the main thread for the film, meaning you're kind of also interpreting the book in new and interesting ways that focus on particular ideas. Part of why Shakespeare or Dickens can have remakes is because there's so much depth to interpret that something new can always be done. But that's not the case for everything. Disney live action remakes, there's no solid purpose, no new way of interpreting the original story. It's just the same basic story but with live action and maybe less music. A change of technology on its own isn't a reason, that's just spectacle. Nothing new is actually being expressed in the film. Furthermore, not all stories have space for prequels or sequels and things. Characters often have a clear arc. They get to the end of the arc and that's it. They're done, Occasionally you have characters in positions where you can expand the arc further with new challenges to push them in new ways, but that's not always possible, not without forcing the character to become someone they weren't, just so we can see them develop again. And it's incredibly frustrating when that happens, because it kind of kills who they were in the first place and kills the character you kind of fell in love with. And not every fictional world has space for spin-offs either. Better Call Saul managed to work because he was an interesting enough character to be a protagonist in his own right. The world of A Song of Ice and Fire is vast enough that George R.R. Martin could write a near endless amount of separate stories about characters in other time periods and still have each of them carry their own thematic exploration or interesting situations if he put enough work into it and kept avoiding writing The Winds of Winter. I'd even argue Harry Potter is rich enough that you could tell a very interesting story about Newt Scamander learning about magical creatures and caring for them. However, one of the problems with those films is that that's not what they do. It's instead of becoming their own thing about Newt Scamander, he's kind of dropped in place of a story about a villain kind of similar to Voldemort doing similar villainous things, and the main story being a similar battle of epic proportions like Harry Potter became in its end. So it's kind of that again, but now without the charm of a wizard school. The charm Newt Scamander and the idea of caring about magical creatures could have brought to the story is never more than a minor plot point, really. Oh, that's another point, actually. Once a story in a franchise has scaled up to epic proportions, you can't then go even more epic, and even bigger. That doesn't work. It starts to become substanceless when you try to force that. But yeah, we really need to talk about the soft reboot now, though. So the soft reboot is like some horrible, meaningless hyper-reality in which it's sort of a sequel. The Force Awakens, Last Jedi, The Rise of Skywalker are all technically sequels to the original Star Wars trilogy, but they're also sort of technically a reboot at the same time, meaning you end up with something that's not quite either, and therefore feels both pointless and empty. They carry on the story with a mostly new cast of younger characters, but rather than thinking, where is the space for this story to go next, like George Lucas's original plan for the sequels did, characters now trying to rebuild the Republic, and how just because they've overthrown the Galactic Empire doesn't mean it's then straightforward to install a successful democracy. There are new, realistic challenges that can tell a vastly different story and push characters in new, unexpected ways. That would be a sequel. Not just a story that happens after the last story, but something that meaningfully carries things forward, something that feels like further exploration. Instead, we get scrap that, let's just basically do the original trilogy again, but it's with new characters and a couple of old ones popping up to make it all feel familiar. That's then not adding anything. More so, it makes everything achieved by these characters we love feel completely pointless. Luke helped defeat Darth Sidious and the Empire. Nope, somehow Palpatine returns. There's another sort of Darth Vader figure with another dictatorship that requires a resistance movement again. Luke and Han and Leia's achievements before were all kind of for nothing. That kind of diminishes the feel you get at the original trilogy's conclusion, So not only are you gaining nothing new, not only does it undermine the whole purpose of the original story and their characters, but it also makes everything feel not quite real. As I say, this odd mix between something that's a remake and also carrying things on makes it feel like a shallow, ghostly hyper-reality. Those aren't the right words to explain it, but that's the best I can think of. And the cameo appearances of old beloved characters can add to that as well. Sometimes they're brought back to force them into a scene that doesn't at all suit their original character, or to reference that old thing they did in the originals, and we go, aha, that's like the thing from the first movie, but it feels completely shallow, and it makes it feel like that character never actually progressed beyond that point if they're doing it again. They're stuck in some loop repeating over the same ground forever, like they're trapped inside some developed GIF or something. That's the complete opposite to the closure of a finished and fulfilling character arc. And similar as well when you get these new characters doing the exact same thing as the original cast in order to reference that film. That adds nothing and makes it all feel meaningless. Is the entire fictional world I love actually just trapped in an endless cycle of repeating itself? Does nothing ever truly progress? That's like some sort of horror story, It's enough to give you an existential crisis. It is like these films are accidentally creating their own existential crisis behind a thin veil of nostalgia. These updates to franchises can be about passing on the torch to a new audience, I think. A younger generation of people who can enjoy this world their parents once loved, and both generations can then kind of bond over this new experience of that world. The thing is, soft reboots take that literally and cram that emotional experience of passing a story onto a younger generation, and they make that the plot of the film itself. Ghostbusters happened, now let's pass the torch onto a younger generation and watch them do the same thing. Jurassic Park happens, now let's pass that on for a new cast to do the exact same thing. I thought the point of passing on a torch is to take it forwards in your own way, not to literally walk the same ground again, because that sounds incredibly disempowering. And what you're doing is creating a clear point of comparison. It makes all the new cast feel like a shallow copy of the original, which makes you like it less, and I think even sets the fan base at war with itself, between a new generation who don't know the original and therefore aren't as disappointed by this film, and old fans who treat it like the death of something they love. Instead of two different age groups coming together and passing something on, they end up doing the opposite and fighting each other, and that's kind of sad, really. Culturally, that's probably the worst thing out of all of this. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on reboots. They can be good, but you have to question whether or not there is a meaningful point to the film in the first place. The only way it'll end is if fans get so disappointed they give up and it stops becoming profitable to make films that aren't great quality. If nobody watching Morbius becomes more of a norm for these types of films, there's some glimmer of hope there, I guess. Overall, I don't feel too disheartened. There are still wonderful films and shows being made. You just have to look beyond what marketing insists on shoving in your face, I think. Those are my thoughts. Let me know what I've missed, what I've gotten wrong. I understand this is a very broad topic and it's hard to condense everything into one video. But if you did like it, give it a like, subscribe, maybe support me on Patreon, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Janice McMahon, Luke Orr, CrzychuKB, Michael Gallagher, InSquares, Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier and Chad Bramwell. Thank you.